All right, let's go. Number 10, the atlatl. In 1989, in a rock shelter called Combe-Saunière in the Dordogne region of France, the prehistorian Pierre Catalan examined a small hooked sliver of reindeer antler that had come out of the excavation years earlier. It was not much to look at. A curved piece of bone, worked at one end into a hook, worn smooth by handling. It was around 17,500 years old, and it is the oldest surviving fragment of one of the most important weapons our species ever made. The weapon is the spearthrower. Most people know it by an Aztec word, the atlatl. The device itself is almost embarrassingly simple. It is a shaft of wood or antler, usually less than a meter long, with a hook or a shallow socket at one end. The butt of a light spear, called a dart, rests against that hook. The thrower holds the shaft and the dart together, sweeps the arm forward, and at the last instant the shaft pivots, snapping the dart away. What it does, in mechanical terms, is add a second joint to the human arm. Your forearm is a lever. The spear thrower becomes an extension of that lever, and the extra length multiplies the speed at the far tip. A dart a strong person might throw by hand at 60 or 70 kilometers an hour leaves an atlatl far faster, and it leaves with enough force to bury a stone point in muscle and bone. A spear thrower can send a dart well over 100 meters. In practice, it was most accurate inside 20 meters, which is close enough to hit and far enough to keep a hunter away from the hooves and horns of a dying animal. What makes the spear thrower remarkable is not the range. It is where it appears. The same basic tool shows up on separate continents, among people who never met and never traded. The oldest examples we have are the carved antler hooks of Ice Age Europe, some shaped into leaping animals, small pieces of art. But the woomera in Australia, the throwing boards of the Arctic, the atlatls of the Americas were all invented on their own. The physics were simply there, waiting. Any group that threw spears for long enough would eventually stumble onto the same answer. That is the quiet lesson buried in a simple weapon. Lethal technology does not always begin with one clever inventor and spread outward. Sometimes it appears wherever the conditions allow, again and again, because the advantage is too large to overlook. A target that walks away from a hand-thrown spear may not walk away from one thrown twice as hard. That margin, small in any single throw, compounds across thousands of hunts and thousands of years. It is one of the tools that let people bring down the largest animals of the Ice Age with something they could carry in one hand. And it crossed into the Americas with the very first people to enter that continent. The spear thrower never truly died. In parts of Australia, people still make and use the woomera, matching the weight and flex of a dart to the person who throws it, shaping the hook by hand. It is not a relic behind glass. It is a working tool, held by people whose ancestors carried it tens of thousands of years before anyone poured metal or drew a coastline. The antler hook from that French cave and a woomera cut this year belong to the same single idea. It has simply never stopped being useful. Number 9, the mace. For most of human prehistory, a weapon was also something else. A spear killed an animal and then helped butcher it. A stone point could cut, scrape, and dig. A hand axe did a dozen jobs. The tools our ancestors carried had to earn their place across many tasks, because a Stone Age hunter could not afford to make something that did only one thing. The mace breaks that pattern completely. A mace is a heavy head fixed to a handle. That is all. A ball of stone, later of copper or bronze, drilled through the center and mounted on a shaft. It cannot dig. It cannot skin an animal. It is clumsy at cutting and useless at scraping. Its entire design points at a single outcome, which is the delivery of a crushing blow to a narrow spot at speed. Around 10,000 years ago, in the pre-pottery Neolithic of the Near East, across sites in Anatolia, Mesopotamia, and the Jordan Valley, these drilled stone heads begin to appear. Some later versions were shaped with flanges and knobs, ridges that concentrate the force of a strike into an even smaller area, so that the energy lands not as a bruise, but as a fracture. There is a reason that shape is so telling. A cutting edge has other uses. A heavy round head does not. It is poor at almost everything except one task, transferring the full weight of a swing into the thin dome of a skull. The bone of the human head is strong against a spread-out load and fragile against a concentrated one. A mace is a machine for finding that weakness, where earlier people improvised, snatching up a rock or a branch when they had to. The mace was made in advance, carried in expectation of the moment it would be used. But here's where the archaeology turns cold. We do not only have the weapon, we have what it did. Across Neolithic Europe and the Near East, excavators keep finding skulls with a particular kind of injury. Rounded, depressed fractures on the top and side of the head, exactly where a downward blow from a blunt weapon would land. At some sites, these appear on many individuals at once, adults grouped together in a single grave, struck from behind or above. In parts of early Neolithic Europe, whole farming communities were wiped out this way. At certain mass graves, the wounds cluster on the back of the skull, the pattern you would expect from captives killed one after another, not from fighters falling in the confusion of a battle. This is not a hunting accident. It is the physical signature of people killing other people, deliberately, with a tool built for nothing else. The mace marks a threshold. It is one of the first objects we know of that was engineered from the start, with no purpose except to end another human life. Not to hunt, not to defend against a predator, to fight other people. Its arrival tracks the same period when villages grew, when grain was stored, when there was suddenly something worth taking and someone willing to take it. And yet, the mace did not stay on the battlefield. As metal weapons grew more effective, it slowly lost its edge as a practical tool of war, and it became something stranger. It turned into a symbol. Kings and rulers across the ancient world carried the mace not to swing it, but to signify a right, the authority to strike, to punish, to kill. The oldest weapon designed purely for human violence became the emblem of power itself. We still carry its descendants. A ceremonial staff, a scepter, the heavy mace laid on the table of a parliament. All of them are the same head on the same handle, kept long after the killing was handed to other machines. Number 8. The throwing stick. It is a curved piece of mammoth ivory, a little over 70 centimeters long, sweeping in a shallow arc like a crescent. It was found in 1985 in Oblazowa Cave in the limestone hills of southern Poland by a team led by the archaeologist Paweł Waldonowak. It did not lie alone. Beside it rested a single human finger bone, along with antler tools, pierced fox teeth, a bead, and traces of ochre. Everything about the deposit was strange, and for years the object's age was uncertain. The reason it matters is what it is. It is a boomerang. Not the light, returning kind sold to tourists, but the older, deadlier kind. A heavy throwing stick shaped to fly straight and fast, and to strike a hard blow at distance. Carved from the tusk of a woolly mammoth, worked and polished, its wear patterns show it was handled by a right-handed person and thrown many times. As a piece of craft, it is extraordinary. To shape a long, balanced, aerodynamic curve out of dense ivory using stone tools and to get the flight right takes a maker who understood exactly what the object was supposed to do. And what it was supposed to do was hurt. A heavy throwing stick, hurled flat and spinning, carries far more mass than an arrow, and lands with a blunt, bone-breaking force. Thrown into a flock of birds or a cluster of small game, it does not need to be aimed at a single point. Its length means a near miss is often still a hit. Against a running animal, it can shatter a leg and end the chase. Against a person, the same blow lands the same way. These were not toys. The returning boomerang most people picture is the exception, a lighter recreational form. The old ones were built to strike and to keep the target down. And then, in 2025, the date was tested again. Earlier attempts had placed the ivory at around 18,000 years, which already made it ancient. But careful radiocarbon work on the human bone and animal remains from the same layer, published that year by a team led by Saratalamo, pushed the age far deeper, to somewhere between 39 and 42,000 years old. That makes this piece of mammoth ivory the oldest boomerang ever found anywhere on Earth, older than the classic wooden boomerangs of Australia by roughly 30,000 years. Think about what that gap really means. In Australia, throwing sticks were carried for far more than combat. People used them to hunt, to fight, to dig, to strike fire, to clap out the rhythm of a song. A single curved length of wood was an entire toolkit, and the oldest of those to survive, from Wiry Swamp in South Australia, are only around 10,000 years old. Wood rots. Ivory sometimes does not. So the Polish boomerang is almost certainly not the first of its kind. It is only the oldest one that happened to survive, which tells us the true age of the thrown wooden weapon runs back further than we can now see, into a record that has simply decayed. For a long time, the boomerang was treated as something particular to Australia, a signature of one continent. It was not. In a cold cave in Ice Age Europe, 40,000 years ago, someone shaped a hunting weapon from a mammoth's tusk and laid it in the ground beside a human hand. Some researchers wonder whether the whole arrangement, the ivory, the finger, the pierced teeth, and the ochre, marks a burial or a rite rather than a lost toolkit. We do not know if it was left as a weapon, a treasure, or an offering. What survives is the curve of the ivory, still holding the marks of the hand that made it, and a single question about what that hand believed. Number 7. The barbed points from the river. In 1988, on the banks of the Simlicay River in the Western Rift Valley, the archaeologists Alison Brooks and John Yellen recovered something that should not, by the rules of the time, have existed. The place was then called Zaire. Today it is the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Buried in old river sediment, at a site called Katanda, were points carved from bone. Some were plain. Others were worked with rows of barbs down one edge, the finished tips of harpoons made to sink into flesh and hold. There was even a dagger-like piece of bone, and beside them lay the bones of enormous catfish. The barbs are the whole point of the design. A plain spear can be pulled out of a wounded animal, or work its own way loose as the animal struggles. A barbed harpoon does the opposite. Once it enters, the backward-facing teeth catch against flesh, so that every thrash drives it deeper, and every pull only sets it harder. In water, where a speared fish can twist away in a heartbeat, that difference is everything. To carve a row of barbs into bone is to have understood and solved the problem of holding a struggling animal you cannot simply grab. The trouble was the date. When Brooks and Yellen dated the deposit by more than one method, the numbers came back at around 90,000 years old, and possibly older. Barbed bone harpoons like these were not supposed to appear until the late Ice Age of Europe, tens of thousands of years afterward. Many researchers simply refused to believe it. The tools looked too refined, too modern, too clever for people that far back. The dating was questioned for years, but the site held up under repeated scrutiny, and the harpoons stayed where the evidence put them, deep in a past no one had expected them to occupy. What makes the Katanda points so unsettling is exactly that age. 90,000 years ago, along an African river, people were not just scavenging or grabbing what they could. They were carving specialized weapons for a specialized purpose, targeting large fish, some of the catfish weighing as much as a grown adult, enough meat to feed a group for days. To make a barbed harpoon, you must plan several steps ahead. You must understand the animal, the water, and the way a barb behaves under a thrashing pull. This is not desperation. It is knowledge applied. For a long time, the deep past of Africa was imagined as a slow, simple prelude, with the real burst of human creativity happening later, in the painted caves of Europe. Katanda is one of the sites that broke that picture. Elsewhere in Africa, their distant neighbors were making beads, grinding pigment, and shaping fine stone blades. On the Simlicay, people were doing something else. They were reading a river, tracking its fish, and building tools tuned to that one environment. Specialization like this, a technology aimed at one narrow way of getting food, is a mark of exactly the flexible planning we think of as fully modern. Who were they? These people fishing a river 90,000 years ago with barbed bone points that would not be matched anywhere else for another 60,000 years. We can see their weapons and their catch. We cannot see them. No faces, no names, no sense of what they told each other about the river, or the fish, or the making of the points. They belong to a growing body of evidence that the modern human mind, the capacity to plan, to specialize, to invent, was already fully present in Africa long before our ancestors carried it out into the wider world. The harpoons are among the oldest signs of that mind at work on the problem of catching food. What remains is a handful of barbed bone points and a heap of fish bones on an ancient shore, and the quiet fact that everything needed to make them was already inside the people who did. Number 6. The arrow tipped in poison. The object is easy to miss. A slender wooden stick, broken, no thicker than a pencil, scored along its length with fine notches. It came from Border Cave, in the mountains between South Africa and Eswatini, and for years it was simply another item in a collection. Then, in 2012, a team led by Francesco D'Erico published a chemical study of what clung to its surface. Using gas chromatography to read the residue, they identified ricinoleic acid, a compound tied to the castor bean. It is one of the most poisonous plants in the world. The stick was directly dated to around 24,000 years ago. It closely resembled the notched applicators that sand hunters in the Kalahari used, within living memory, to smear poison onto their arrows. The implication was direct. If the reading was right, this was the oldest chemical evidence of a weapon poison anywhere. It marked a moment when a human being took a plant's toxin and turned it into a way to kill at a distance. But here's where the evidence divides. Other researchers pushed back hard. Ricinoleic acid, they pointed out, is also the main component of castor oil, which people use to treat hides and skin. Ricin, the deadly protein in the castor bean, is destroyed by heat, and the residue on the stick showed signs of heating. Perhaps this was not a poison applicator at all, but a tool for softening leather or preparing food. The debate is real, and it is honest, and it turns on the difference between a plausible reading and a certain one. What has happened since is that the deeper pattern has grown stronger, not weaker. In 2024, from Kruger Cave in South Africa, researchers described the marrow cavity of a 7,000-year-old antelope bone that had been used as a quiver, still holding 3 bone arrowheads set into a hardened paste. That paste contained cardiac glycosides, heart poisons, drawn from more than one plant, mixed into a single recipe. It is the oldest poison blend we can prove beyond argument. And in 2025, from another South African shelter, came direct traces of a plant toxin on the tips of stone arrow segments dating back around 60,000 years. That pushes the whole idea far deeper than Border Cave ever did. Understand how these poisons actually work, and the picture darkens. Cardiac glycosides attack the heart directly, throwing its rhythm into failure. An animal struck by a poisoned arrow does not drop where it stands. It runs. The hunters follow, sometimes for hours or days, tracking the failing creature until the toxin finishes what the small wound alone never could. This is a way of hunting built on patience as much as on the shot. It also demands an intimate reading of which plants in the landscape carry death in their sap, their roots, their seeds. The reason poison matters is arithmetic. A small arrow tip, driven by a light bow, does not carry enough force to kill a large animal outright. It makes a wound. Poison finishes what the wound begins. It turns a scratch into a death sentence, and it lets a person the size of a hunter bring down prey many times heavier. This is the origin of something disturbing. Not stronger muscles, not a sharper edge, but chemistry. The deliberate use of a plant's own defenses as a weapon against flesh. A plant builds its poison to keep from being eaten. Somewhere in deep prehistory, a human being turned that defense around and aimed it outward, at prey, and eventually at other people. It is the first chemistry we know of, worked out with no laboratory, only observation, memory, and a willingness to test what would kill. We know the practice survived, because people were still doing it a century ago. What did not survive are most of the recipes. Which plants, in which amounts, prepared in which order, brought to the right strength without poisoning the maker. That knowledge lived in hands and memories, and when a way of life ended, most of it went with them, leaving only the poisoned residue on a broken stick. Number 5. The sling. On the dry coast of Peru, where almost nothing decays, archaeologists have pulled woven slings out of ancient graves, some of them around 4,500 years old. They are among the oldest slings that survive anywhere, braided cords of plant fiber with a widened cradle in the middle to hold a stone. In the Old World, the sling reaches back even further as an idea. Rounded stones shaped as ammunition turn up at Near Eastern sites from the 6th millennium before the Common Era, in the early farming villages of the Levant. The sling is one of the oldest weapons humans ever used, and it is one of the most underestimated. The whole thing is a cord and a pouch. A stone or a molded clay bullet sits in the cradle. The slinger whirls it in a circle and releases one end of the cord at the right moment, and the stone flies. The physics are the same as the spearthrower, taken further. By spinning the projectile at the end of a long radius, a person builds speed that no arm could ever match by throwing. A sling stone can leave the pouch at over 100 kilometers an hour. In skilled hands, faster. And unlike a bow, the sling weighs almost nothing, costs almost nothing, and its ammunition lies on the ground everywhere. A bow must be carved, strung, and kept dry. A sling is a knot away from ready. It never runs out of stones while there are stones underfoot. That cheapness is part of why it lasted so long and spread so far. Nearly every ancient people that fought on foot found its way to the sling, and most kept it in service for thousands of years. The stone does not need to pierce. That is the part people miss. A sling bullet kills the way a modern bullet's shock does, by delivering a violent blow that shatters bone and ruptures what lies beneath, even through a helmet or a shield. Ancient writers described lead bullets that seemed to vanish into the body, and wounds that killed without any visible cut. Modern testing suggests they were seeing the effects of blunt force delivered fast enough to break bone and burst the tissue around it. A helmet could turn a blade and still fail against a stone. The energy simply passed through the metal into the bone beneath. The sling did not stay a hunting tool. It became one of the deadliest ranged weapons of the ancient battlefield. Whole peoples grew famous for it. The slingers of the Balearic Islands were prized as mercenaries across the Mediterranean, carried into war by Carthage and Rome, and were said to train their children by setting food on a high pole and refusing to let them eat until they could knock it down. Assyrian carvings show ranks of slingers loosing stones over the heads of their own front lines. Later armies cast their bullets from lead, small and dense and aerodynamic, and some slingers scratched messages into the mold before they poured, taunts meant to be found in the enemy's body. Written records describe slingers whose range outreached the bows arrayed against them. A trained slinger could drop a person from beyond the reach of many archers, and could do it several times a minute. That is why the sling unsettles, in a way its simplicity hides. It erased the advantage of size, of armor, of expensive weapons. It put lethal reach into the hands of the poorest fighter on the field, made from a scrap of cord and whatever stones lay underfoot. The weapon that looked like nothing could kill the man in armor. History remembers it mostly through a single story, a shepherd boy and a giant, which is exactly the point of that story. It is still not entirely gone. In parts of the Peruvian Andes, people keep slings alive, using them to herd animals, and on certain festival days, to stage sling contests that echo a far older kind of combat. A length of cord, a smooth stone, and a turning arm remain, after all these millennia, a way for the small to strike the large. Number 4. The Clovis point. In 2011, the archaeologist Michael Waters and a team of researchers announced a result that had been sitting inside a mastodon for more than 13,000 years. At a site near Sequim in Washington state called the Mace site, a rib bone from a mastodon held a fragment embedded in it. Using high-resolution scans, they digitally reconstructed the object inside the bone, and it was the tip of a projectile point. Radiocarbon dating put the animal and the attack at around 13,800 years ago, some 8 centuries before the famous Clovis toolmakers appear in the record. Someone had hunted a mastodon at the very end of the last ice age and left the proof lodged in its ribs, except the point that struck it was made of the animal itself. When the team analyzed the fragment, it turned out to be shaped from mastodon bone, a weapon carved from the same kind of creature it was used to kill. Bone and ivory points like it were durable and deadly, and they were doing the work of hunting the largest animals in North America before stone-tipped Clovis weapons ever existed. The Clovis point, when it does arrive around 13,000 years ago, is one of the most recognizable weapons in prehistory. A leaf-shaped blade of finely worked stone with a distinctive channel, a flute, chipped up each face so it could be seated into a wooden shaft. That flute is a small marvel and a large gamble. It was made by striking a long flake off the base of the point in a single blow that, if it went wrong, shattered hours of careful work. No one is entirely sure why Clovis snappers took the risk. It may have helped bind the point to the shaft, or let it sink deeper, or simply marked the weapon as a Clovis weapon made the right way. Whatever the reason, the technique spread across a continent within a few centuries, one of the fastest moving ideas in early America. And these points are found alongside the bones of mammoths, mastodons, and other giants. Here the story opens onto one of the largest and most contested arguments in all of archaeology. Because within a window of roughly a couple of thousand years, most of the great animals of the Americas vanished. The mammoths, the mastodons, giant ground sloths, camels, horses, the saber-toothed cats that hunted them. Dozens of entire genera. Gone. Did we do this? One school of thought, the overkill hypothesis, argues that skilled human hunters arriving with these weapons drove the megafauna into extinction, a rolling wave of killing across 2 continents. Its strongest version came from the scientist Paul Martin. He pictured a swift front of hunters sweeping down through the Americas, meeting animals that had never learned to fear people, and killing their way south in a matter of centuries. It is a striking idea, and it may be partly true, but the timing is messier than a clean sweep. The climate at the end of the Ice Age was swinging violently, and animals that had survived 100 earlier warm spells died out only when both pressures arrived at once. The Manus mastodon, wounded long before Clovis, is one reason many now doubt the simplest slaughter story. The truth is almost certainly tangled, a collision of a warming world and a new predator carrying stone-tipped spears. What is not in doubt is the haunting silence that followed. North America once held elephants and lions and sloths the size of cars. They are gone. They are not coming back. And we still cannot say for certain how much of that emptiness our weapons caused. What happened there was not the last time either. Across the world, the arrival of humans with better weapons and the disappearance of the largest animals tend to track each other, again and again, down to our own century. The Clovis point remains, chipped and elegant, scattered by the thousands across a continent that used to be full of giants. It outlasted nearly everything it was pointed at. Number 3, the bow and arrow. Deep inside a rock shelter called Sibudu, in the green hills of KwaZulu-Natal in South Africa, the sediment holds layers that reach back tens of thousands of years. Sorting through them, the archaeologist Marlies Lombard and others found small, backed stone segments, quartz pieces shaped and blunted along one edge so they could be glued into a shaft. On some of these tiny points were microscopic fractures and residues, the wear left by high-speed impact and the remains of the glue and binding that once held them in place. The layers date to around 64,000 years ago. A bone point from the same site, worked to a fine tip, dates to a little over 60,000. Together they form the oldest strong evidence anywhere for a weapon that would go on to rule human conflict for longer than any other. The bow is a machine for storing energy. A hunter draws the string, and the wood or sinew of the limbs bends and holds the pull like a coiled spring. Release the string, and all that stored force pours into the arrow at once, far more than an arm could ever deliver directly. The result is a small, fast projectile. It can be aimed, it can be carried by the dozen, it can be loosed again and again from cover, and it can be loosed quickly. A practiced archer can loose several arrows in the time it takes an enemy to close a short distance on foot. A single bow in steady hands becomes a stream of incoming death rather than one throw. Later, peoples pushed the design further, gluing together wood, horn, and sinew into composite bows that packed enormous force into a short, curved frame, small enough to shoot from horseback. But the core invention is already here, in these African layers. Not every researcher agrees the Sibudu evidence proves a true bow rather than some other kind of thrown or flung weapon, and that caution is fair. But the pattern of tiny, standardized, hafted points, made to be lost by the handful, points strongly toward archery, and it points to it in Africa, deep in the Ice Age. Building a bow, after all, is not one insight, but a chain of them. You need a stave that bends without breaking, a string that holds tension without snapping, arrows straight and light enough to fly true, points small enough to carry in numbers, and glue and binding to hold the whole system together. Some researchers argue that assembling that many parts into one working machine reflects a mind able to plan several moves deep, the same flexible intelligence that would later build everything else. On this reading, the bow is not only a weapon, it is a fossil of how these people thought. The most unsettling thing about the bow is not how it kills. It is how it changed who could kill, and from how far. A bow does not require the strength to close with a dangerous animal or a dangerous person. It requires practice and a steady hand. It lets a hunter strike from a distance, from concealment, before the target knows anyone is near. Turn that on other people, and warfare is transformed. The bow made ambush lethal. It made numbers count in a new way. A line of archers loosing arrows into an approaching enemy long before that enemy arrived. From the moment it appears, the bow becomes the dominant ranged weapon of the human species. It holds that place across the rise and fall of nearly every early civilization, from the deserts of Egypt to the plains of Asia to the forests of the Americas. Then, the gun takes it away. Tens of thousands of years of human history are shaped by the reach of the drawn string. And it is, in a real sense, still in you. The steadiness, the aim, the ability to hold a plan in mind and release it at the right instant. These are the traits the bow rewarded. Generation after generation, for longer than any other weapon we have ever made. The weapon is ancient. The impulse it perfected to reach out and strike from safety remains one of the most human things we do. Number 2, the oldest complete weapons we have. Between 1994 and 1999, in an open-cast coal mine near the German town of Schoningen, the archaeologist Hartmut Thieme and his colleagues uncovered something that rewrote what we thought our distant ancestors were capable of. In a band of ancient lakeshore mud, sealed and preserved by the chemistry of the ground, they found spears. Not stone points that once tipped spears, but the wooden shafts themselves. Whole, slender lengths of spruce and pine, shaped and balanced, around 2 meters long. Wood almost never survives across such spans of time. Here, in the mud of a vanished lake, it did. The find is called the Spear Horizon, and the spears did not lie alone. Around them were the butchered bones of more than 20 wild horses, along with stone and bone tools. The wood was worked with care, the weight set toward the front like a modern javelin, so the weapon would fly point first. These were not crude sticks. They were engineered, throwing and thrusting weapons, made by people who understood balance and flight. As a feat of preservation and craft, the whole assemblage is extraordinary. For years, experts argued the spears were too heavy to throw and could only have been jabbed into trapped animals at close range. Then, researchers ran the experiment. In controlled tests, trained athletes launched accurate replicas of the Shoningen spears and put them on target at distances of up to 20 meters, showing that these weapons could indeed be hurled with real force and precision. The people at that lake were not only cornering horses, they could strike them from a distance. And among the wooden finds was something besides spears, a short, double-pointed stick worked at both ends that seems to have been thrown spinning to knock birds and small game off the water and out of the air, a thrown wooden weapon 300,000 years old. Then comes the part that reorders everything. For a long time, our ancient relatives of this depth and time were imagined as scavengers, scraping meat from carcasses that other predators had killed, too simple to plan a hunt. The Shoningen spears ended that picture. Here was proof of organized cooperative hunting of big game carried out with purpose-built weapons by a group working together. Picture what that took. To drive a herd of horses against the water, to place the throwers, to time the ambush, to share the meat of 24 carcasses, is not the work of a lone forager. It takes coordination, communication, and a plan held in common. Whatever these people used for language, they were organizing complex cooperative violence against large animals an enormously long time ago. And the people who made these weapons were not us. They were not Homo sapiens at all. Our species did not yet exist. The most likely makers were Homo heidelbergensis, or the early ancestors of the Neanderthals, a different kind of human, standing at that lakeshore with spears in their hands. How old are they? That is still argued. Early estimates placed the spears near 400,000 years. Later, dating pulled the figure toward 300,000, and a study in 2025, reading amino acids locked in tiny fossil snail shells from the same layer, argued for something closer to 200,000. Even at the youngest end, the number is staggering. At least 200,000 years ago, and perhaps twice that, beings not of our species were building the finest hunting weapons of their age and using them as a team. Now hold that against what did not survive. We have these spears because of a freak of chemistry, a lakeshore that happened to preserve wood. Across the hundreds of thousands of years, these weapons were in use. Almost every one of them rotted it away to nothing. The wooden spears, the shafts, the throwing sticks, the countless perishable tools our ancestors carried through deep time are simply gone, leaving us to imagine an entire technology from the handful of pieces that beat the odds. The people are gone too. No faces, no voices, only the marks of their hands on a few lengths of ancient wood and the horses they killed, still lying where they fell. Number 1. The weapon that started everything. In the early 1980s, an archaeologist named Peter Beaumont dug into an old, infilled sinkhole in the northern Cape of South Africa at a place called Kathupan. Among the layers he pulled out were stone points, carefully shaped, with worked bases. They sat in collections for decades. Then, in 2012, a team led by Jane Wilkins took a hard, close look at them, and what they concluded pushed the story of the weapon back further than almost anyone had dared to place it. The points from the oldest layer at Kathupan are around 500,000 years old, and Wilkins and her colleagues argued they were not simple handheld tools. They were spear tips, meant to be fixed to a wooden shaft. The evidence was patient and physical. The tips carried a particular kind of fracture, the sort that forms when a point slams into something at speed, the mark of impact rather than cutting. The bases showed wear and shaping in the exact places where a point would be bound into a shaft. To test the idea, the team made replicas from the same stone, mounted them, and drove them into animal carcasses, then compared the damage. They went further, firing replica points from a calibrated crossbow into carcasses to reproduce the exact forces of a strike, and studying the breaks under magnification. The fractures on the 500,000-year-old points looked like the breaks made by impact, not the nicks and scars left by scraping a hide or slicing meat. The ancient points matched the thrust weapons, not the cutting ones. Not everyone accepts it. Other specialists have argued that some of those fractures could form in other ways, and the debate over Katupan is ongoing and unresolved, as arguments about the deepest past usually are. No wooden shafts survived to settle it. 500,000 years erased the wood, the binding, the hands, and left only the stone. But if the reading holds and the weight of evidence has held so far, then Katupan records the birth of something that changed everything that came after. Before this, the assumption had been that fixing a stone point to a shaft came much later, closer to 300,000 years ago. Katupan, if it stands, moves that birth back by 200,000 years, into a chapter of the human story so remote that our own species lies far in its future. Because this is not really the story of a spear. It is the story of an idea. To take a sharp stone, a straight shaft, and a length of binding, three separate things, and combine them into a single tool that is more than the sum of its parts, is a particular kind of thought. It means holding several steps in the mind at once. It means seeing that materials can be joined into a system. It is worth sitting with how strange that is. Every other animal on Earth uses what its body gives it, or at most picks up a stick or a stone as it finds it. This is different. This is the act of making one object out of several, each shaped for its role, bound into a tool that none of the parts could be alone. That single move, repeated and refined for 500,000 years, is the whole of technology in miniature. The hafted axe, the arrow, the plow, the wheel on the axle, the engine bolted to its frame. Every built object that followed descends from the moment someone first understood that separate pieces could be assembled into something new, and the mind that did it was not ours. 500,000 years ago, our species was still more than 200,000 years from existing. The hands that fitted the first stone point to the first shaft belonged to an earlier kind of human, standing on the African veld, solving a problem we would build a civilization on top of. They had no writing. They had no cities. They had no idea what they had begun. They simply saw that a stone alone was one thing, and a stone bound to a shaft was another, far more dangerous thing. And they made it. And the world was never the same. That is the strangest inheritance of all. Not the poison, or the sling, or the fluted point buried in the mastodon's rib. It is that the first great leap in human technology, the leap that runs in a straight line to everything we have ever built, was a leap toward a better weapon. The bound spear did not come after the tools of peace. It came before them. Before we wrote, before we farmed, before we were even the humans we are now, an earlier kind of mind was already learning to join sharp things to strong things and drive them into flesh. Everything else we have made stands on top of that. The city, the cathedral, the machine you are reading this on. All of it descends from a stone lashed to a stick, 500,000 years ago, made to kill. The weapon came first. If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now and make sure to subscribe.